Today's daf we're going to be learning, Shavua Tov to everyone, is Yoma Kaf Aleph. Today's daf is sponsored by Elizabeth Jacob in memory of Danny Morris and all those killed in the tragic accident in Meron. May his memory be a blessing and may his family be comforted among the mourners of Zion. And to all those who were killed and to those who are injured, may it be a refuah shlema for them. It's actually interesting how the sugyot of already yesterday's daf and then the upcoming dapim seem to relate to this topic. So we'll come back to that as we learn. And also by Elisheva Rappaport, in memory of her beloved sister, Razel Zucker's first yurtzeit. Razel and her husband made Aliyah to Israel and were raising their 8 children in Beitar Elite, where Razel often hosted Jewish learning events for women. May our learning bring an Aliyat Neshama to Tovi Razel Bat Zlata. Okay, today we're going to be learning a lot about miracles. It's helpful to use the sheet because there's going to be there's a big chart that I made on the sheet that will help you organize what's happening today. Okay, we ended with this braita on Kaf Amud, which talked about these 3 kolot holchim misof haolam va'ad sofo. There's 3 sounds in the world that can be heard all around the world, right? It kind of sounds like this shocking event that just happened. That also, things like that are heard everywhere. Right, which reminds us of this event of, the voice of people dying, the scream. Some people say even childbirth, which is the malach who's in charge of water in the world, which again, we talked about as the idea of parnasah, sustenance, of the people crying out for need for sustenance. Ubai Rabbanan Rachame Anishama B'Sha'ah Sheyotzah Min Haguf Ubatlua. And we have this interesting line that the rabbis asked for rachamim, that we shouldn't hear that sound. It was too hard for us to handle. And therefore they asked for mercy, that we didn't hear that sound wouldn't be as loud as it was. And actually Bitlua. Their prayer worked, and that sound is no longer heard. Okay, what exactly that sound is referring to, and is it really no longer heard anymore? It's hard for us to know what exactly that is. Anyway, it's an image to have in mind. We're going to actually see other sugyot about how they asked for things to be removed and they get removed. This famous sugya that will come up about that also. Okay, this idea of the sounds is going to keep coming back. Okay, and as I said, we're going to see a little bit about religious zealousy and all that, and religious fervor that leads to tragedy over the course of the next 2 dapim, which, as I said, is again very weird coincidence. And this idea of the voices is going to come, the sounds is going to come back. So keep it in mind, and we're going to come back to it. This was all in the context of a braita. If you remember, where were we? We were having this machloka between Rav and Rabbi Shila about is kriyat hagever, the sound, the calling. That's why we got to this thing about the call. The calling of, is it the calling of the rooster or is it the calling of a person? So Rav had said it was the calling of a person, and we brought a braita to prove that. From that, we got off on a bit of a tangent. Now we're going to go to the braita for Rabbi Shila, because the Gemara had said there's a braita that supports this reading and there's a braita that supports that reading. So here's the braita to support Rabbi Shila, that it was a rooster. If you leave your house before the rooster crows, which we'll see it's going to mean the rooster crows, then damo b'rosho, you're deserving of death. This means you did something that you shouldn't have done because it's not safe. If you remember, we've talked about this many times about how unsafe it is to walk out at night. Rabbi Yashai Omer, ad sheyishneh. You can only go out once he does it a second time. By the way, Rashi says mipnei mizikin, right? In other words, again, dangers of the night could be understood. And actually, this is interesting because we're going to see this later in our page also, how things could be understood in a metaphysical way, or that there's actually evil spirits out there, or in the sense that there's robbers at night, and night is a time for prostitution, as we saw the other day, that there's other evils lurking at night, actual evils, not necessarily evil spirit evils. Okay, or maybe the evil spirits is that, maybe, right? There's a whole way of different ways of perceiving this. Okay, we're going to see the same thing with miracles. There's different ways to perceive miracles. Are miracles 100% from God? Or is it that we did our part, right? And because of that, it happened. So we're going to talk about miracles today. And then also there's commentaries that explain the idea of these miracles in 2 different ways, which just show 2 different perspectives of how to understand these kind of gemaras, right? How much do we think that there's miracles and evil spirits around, and how much do we think that it's really man that's making these things happen? And, God's obviously behind it, but there's much, right? And God is much more in a behind the doors kind of way, not as noticeable. So Rabbi Yeshai says you really can't go out until you hear the rooster crow twice. Some people say even 3 times. Now it's clear we're talking about a rooster because they say, what kind of rooster are we talking about? Amru b'tarnagol benoni, the average rooster. In other words, not one that called too early, not one that called too late, but the regular time. That's what we're discussing here. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Another thing about the Mikdash and the holidays. When the Jews would come to the temple, remember there was this huge aliyah laregel, and they would come into the Azara and they would bow down during the holidays. So, right, we know it from Yom Kippur. Kol ha'am homdim ba'azara. Right, now you'll know what those words mean, right? We always say this in our davening. The va'am, right, v'kohanim v'ha'am ha'omdim ba'azara hayu kor'in u'mishtachavim v'noflim al pneihem. That's in the Ashkenazi tefillah. So, right, that's what they would do. They would all be standing in the Azara. We're going to talk about this in 1 minute, because didn't we learn that the Azara, only the Ezrat Yisrael was for Yisraelim, which is this very narrow strip at the beginning of the entrance to the Azara. Okay, then I'll pull it up on the map. All right, we have our Ezrat Nashim, right? Then you go in and you have the Ezrat Yisrael right here, right? So here the Israelite courtyard, which is this first strip in Shar Nikanor. You go in, and then you get to the Ezrat Kohanim. So it seems, so this is an interesting thing. So first of all, I want to point out the Ezrat Kohanim we had, if you remember the whole numbers, there were 11 cubits of the Ezrat Yisrael. The next, and then there was that step that Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov said that led to the Ezrat Kohanim so that you'd have a differentiation. So you'd know no going beyond this. Then we have the Ezrat Kohanim, which is the next strip, which ends by the altar. You didn't need a step to notice that there's a difference here because there's already the altar. That's the demarcation of the next area. So 2 interesting things that we haven't discussed yet. One is the Kohanim were actually not allowed to go beyond the Ezrat Kohanim either unless they needed to do something there. You couldn't just go to the altar area because you're in the mood to go there. Even a Kohen, you had to have a purpose to go there. Number 2, just like the Ezrat Kohanim is for the Kohanim, they couldn't go beyond there unless they had a purpose. Also, the Ezrat Yisrael doesn't mean that they can't go beyond that line. They could go beyond that line if they needed to. Okay, if they needed to go into the, let's say, okay, we talked about a zar can do shchita. He's allowed to slaughter. In fact, in the Korban Pesach, they did. So normally the slaughtering was done in the Beit Mitbachayim, right? That area where they had the rings, that's further in. Okay, hopefully you're getting more familiar with these areas. Okay, so here's, right, so the Ezrat Yisrael is beginning. There's nothing there, if you notice. Then there's the Ezrat Kohanim, there's also nothing there. And then you get to this strip, which we did all the calculations. Remember, there's the space before you get to the ramp, and then the Mizbeach, and then you have this empty space, then you have the rings. You can't really see them here. If I put it closer, maybe. There are the rings, that's where they did the slaughtering. Then you have a little empty area, then you have the tables, and then those nanasim, if you remember. So that area they could go in if they were slaughtering the animal, or if they needed to do smicha on the animal. That was also done there. So they are allowed beyond that line, but only if they need to, not if they want to. If they just want to be there, they're allowed to go in that first strip. Okay, and we're going to see, so if they needed to go in, there's another reason they need to go in, and that's to bow. Okay, people would go into the temple and bow. So they would go in and cram in. Imagine all these people in the temple, and a lot of them want to get in. Okay, again, this reminds us of, unfortunately, what happened on Friday. All these people crowding into one area, but thankfully, in this case, a miracle would happen, and mishtachavim meruvachim. Everybody had 4 amot of space around them, right? Our typical 4-cubit space, which is a space for a person. They were spaced out. They filled up this whole area, right? Which wasn't a teeny area. They would fill up this entire area, okay, all the open space. Okay, if you notice this space where the ulam and the hechal are, this was, by the way, covered. Okay, everything else was open. We're going to talk about that soon. What happened when it rained? Okay, we'll get to that. So we won't really know what happened when it rains, but we're going to learn about a miracle that happened even in the rains. We'll see. And then there's this space behind the Kodesh HaKodeshim that's open. Okay, so this is all closed, but behind it, there's this little strip of 11 cubits also that was called Achorei Beit HaKaporet. It's beyond the Kodesh Kodeshim. They would even be in that area, okay? They would fill in the whole Asara, and it would be so many people that they would fill in that space also, and that would give them more space, and there would be space for everyone to have their own space. They weren't on top of each other. So that's what we just read. So my kamar, so how did this work? Hachi kamar, this is what they meant to say, and I already kind of explained this. Even though there were so many people that they had to go into that area and they were totally full here, the miracle is that when they bowed down, everybody had their own space. And this is one of the famous 10 miracles that happened in the temple. Ditnan, as we know from the Mishnah, Masechet Avot, famous Mishnah. If you don't know it, we'll learn it now. In fact, someone asked me about one of these a few days ago. There were 10 miracles that happened in the temple. The first one's a little bit strange for us to understand, but I guess they thought that women might miscarry from the smell, strong smell of meat, maybe from wanting to eat the meat and not being able to, right? We have the whole sugya of the end of Yoma about an ubarashi richa and a woman who has a craving for food. She smells something and she has to eat the food on Yom Kippur. Is she allowed to? Right? Because they viewed it as possible sakanat nefashot, or maybe it would cause a miscarriage. Well, never happened. A woman never had a miscarriage from the smell of the basar hakodesh, and this the meats in the temple. And the sacrificial meat never went bad, never started smelling and rotted, never happened. And there were never bees swarming around in the area where they slaughtered the animals, right? You would think dead animals, blood, right? Flies. That was the word I was looking for. Thank you. There were never flies in the Beit HaMitbachayim. Now, I told you before that these two ways of viewing the evil spirits, or is it just the real dangers that lurk at night, is the same thing about these miracles here. Some people interpret these miracles as because of what we've done, this never happened because of our part in it, which is, for example, the meat will rot if you leave it. But remember, you have to eat the sacrificial meat on time. So people always dealt with it in a timely manner, and therefore it never happened. Or they washed the meat right away, and that then prevented the flies from coming. Or all these things potentially could have been prevented by humans, or maybe it was really just a miracle from God. So there's two approaches to how to understand it. V'lo ira keri lekohen gadol b'yom kippurim. Right? He never had a seminal emission. We had a whole discussion about this. And in fact, someone asked me based on the fact that isn't it a miracle? So why do we have to take so many precautions? But again, you could say it in the opposite, which is, what do you mean? We don't rely on miracles. And maybe the reason why he never had a seminal emission was because of all the precautions that were taken to make sure that didn't happen. The omer, remember, they cut the night before, they cut the barley crop, then they grind it, make flour out of it, and then they make a mincha offering the next day. Now, if it had gotten disqualified, they'd be in trouble. Why? Because you needed to cut a lot to get the amount of fine flour until they could get the flour as fine as they wanted it, which had to be very fine. It would be a process, and they were doing it at night, so they only did as much as they needed for the korban omer. So if they're the next day and it becomes disqualified, they're stuck. They have no way to bring the omer sacrifice. Likewise with the shtei alechem and the lechem apanim. Shtei alechem is on Shavuot, and they would prepare it. They would bake the bread the day before, even though you can bake on Yantif. There's a whole sugya why didn't they bake it on Yantif? Anyway, putting that aside, they didn't bake it on Yantif because it was something they could have done from before. And therefore, if they were stuck on Yantif and it got disqualified, they'd be in trouble. They wouldn't be able to have it. The next thing is the lechem apanim, which also was switched, if you remember, on Shabbat. So again, they baked it on Friday, and then they brought it in on Shabbat. If it became disqualified, they would be in trouble. So all these things would make it impossible then to fix the situation. And therefore, that was another miracle. So that's another 3 in the list. That's ours. Even though there were a lot of snakes and scorpions in Jerusalem, they never bit anybody, okay, or endangered anybody. And people never said, this place is too small that I don't have a right. Jerusalem is too small. I don't have a place to sleep. Remember, this is the big miracle. They came in Aliyah Regel, and somehow, right, there was room for everybody in Jerusalem. Now, again, some of these you could say were miracles. Some of them you could say it's hard to explain all of them in a realistic manner. But let's say the disqualification of the Lechem HaPanim and the Omer, you could just say they were extra careful because they knew how high the stakes were, and therefore were very careful. Likewise, with the Alim Yerushalayim, there was always enough room because people were very generous and people let in other people into their houses, and somehow they found room for everybody else. I see, Becky, what you're writing, that's going to come up in the Gemara soon. They don't list that here. We're going to get to that later. Why isn't that one listed? So I wanted to mention it because we'll see it in the Gemara. And Becky, you have a good sense of always knowing what's going to come up in the Gemara later on. Okay, so now, the first question, we're going to have a slew of questions on this. Okay, as for example, Becky mentioned another miracle that's not listed here relating to the showbread, so the Lechem HaPanim. So we're going to have a bunch of questions. Why aren't these things mentioned in the list? There's more miracles. And we might have a bit of a reshifting, and that's what the chart is going to show. Okay, if you look at my chart, some of them are going to be replaced by other ones or pushed together into one category, and that only counts as one. And then we're going to add some more, etc. We'll see different things. But the first thing they're asking is, there's some inconsistency in this Mishnah. Patach b'mikdash v'siyem b'Yerushalayim. They start by saying there's 10 miracles that happened in the temple, but the last 2 didn't happen in the temple. They happened in Jerusalem. The people weren't bitten by snakes, and people weren't injured or endangered by snakes and scorpions. And people didn't say, this city's too small, I have nowhere to sleep. So how could that be? So they say, there's actually 2 more in the temple, and basically take out those 2 and replace them with 2 more from the temple. What are these? Ditanya, me'olam lo kibuk shamim esh, let's say, hama'aracha. On the altar that was outside, where they would burn all the sacrifices, there was a fire. As I said, it was all open, so rain could come down and put out the fire very easily. But the rain never put out the fire. That was a miracle. The smoke that came out of there, which we're going to talk about, was there really smoke that came out of there? We're going to have a whole discussion about that. But right now, we assume there was the smoke that came out was never blown aside by the wind. Okay, it never moved. It was basically a straight, right? The smoke went straight up and didn't go to the sides. We're going to have a bunch of questions on that. We'll get to that later on the daf. Okay, so now we've replaced the last 2 with these 2. Now Vituleka, but aren't there more? The Hatane Rav Shmaya b'Kal Nevo, that's where he's from, Kal Nevo. He says, Shivrei klecheres nivlaim bimkoman. Here you have to learn a new halacha, which is that we've learned before that klei cheres can't be koshered. Okay, if something happens to them, you can't kosher them. The only way you could deal with them is to break them, also if they become impure. Now, what happens when you have meat from the sacrifices and you put it in a kli, a sanctified vessel in the temple? And then what happens, as regular, we all know from kashrus, what happens? Meat can get absorbed into the sides of the kli, into the utensil. And then what happens is the meat becomes notar as you leave it. Like the meat that gets swallowed up into the sides of the kli stays in existence beyond the designated time that you're allowed to eat it, because you can't eat the meat that's swallowed up in there. Like the meat itself you eat before, you either have a day or not, right? There's all different, right? Whether you have the night and the day, or whether you have the night, the day, and then the night, the day, and then the next night also. But either which way, at a certain point, it's going to run out. And now you have this meat that's absorbed into the utensil, and that makes the utensil having no tar in it. So then nothing that is now not kosher anymore. It's disqualified. So what do you have to do? The only thing you could do is break it. And you actually have to break it inside the azara because it's got kochim in it, sanctified meat, high sanctity level meat. So what do you have to do? You would break it. That's the only thing you could do. So imagine the temple is full of broken shards. That won't be really useful, right? First of all, if you remember, Kohanim were also walking barefoot, a little bit dangerous, but forgetting about that, it's just a mess. So there was a miracle that these were swallowed up into the ground. Okay, that was a miracle. And another similar miracle, Amar Abaye, other things that were swallowed up. If you remember, there's this place next to the altar where they would put the Trumat HaDeshen. They would take some of the ashes from the maracha, where the sacrifices were burned. They would put a little bit, it was the first activity in the morning, they would put a little bit next to the Mizbeach on the eastern side of the altar. There's a little square over there. And here it is. Here's the altar. And here's that little thing. It's called the place of the ashes. That's where they would put the ashes. And they would also put the mo'an, the notzah, which is the crop and the feathers. There's a bit of a debate, actually. The crop and the feathers and the dishonim mizbeach hapnimi, whatever would come from the inner altar, and the dishonim menorah would all be swallowed up in their place. Okay, this was another miracle that happened, that they'd be swallowed up. Because imagine there's a ton of them. So the crop and this is the mo'an, the notzah from the burnt offerings. The Kohen would throw them into this spot next to the altar where the ashes went. And then also when you clean out the inner altar and the stuff that you would clean out from the menorah, also all those ashes, they were also swallowed up in their place. So this is another miracle. So why aren't these mentioned? So what do they say? Oh, you have 2 on your list? We'll squeeze them into the list that was in the Mishnah in Avot. How so? And by the way, yes, Stacy was saying this. I assume that this is the case. I'm glad you confirmed for me. I assume that when the excavations, I don't know as much about, but these excavations have all these shards there, right? They found by the temple there, all these shards that are likely from here. So now what do they answer? Psule tlatahave, chashvinu bechad, apitre va'ayil tre. What do they say? Let's go back to that list. If you notice in the list, there was the psul that you never had, it disqualified omer, lechem apanim, and shtei alechem. Those are really one miracle because it's saying there were never disqualifications to all of these things. So you can count that as one. And then you can add these 2. Sounds very good. What's the problem? Well, if you're going to put things by categories, never disqualified is all one. Well, these 2 things that we just mentioned are, these things got swallowed up. So why wouldn't you put those as 1 and then we're short 1? That's what the Gemara is going to ask right now. So first they said, let's just read again the words and I'll show you how to see it in the words. Psule tatahave, there's 3 things that were disqualified. Chashvinu bechad, consider them as 1. Apik tre va'ayil tre, take out 2 of them because 2 then go off the list because we're making 3 into 1. So you're subtracting 2, and ayil 2, put in these 2 that we just said about things being swallowed. To which the Gemara asks, Ihachi, bluim nami trehavu. But then whatever was absorbed is also just 1 then. And then we're short 1. Chashvinu bechad, count those as 1, and chasrulu, and then we're missing. So they say, oh, no worries. Ikanami acharite. There's another one. I want to point out, by the way, that we're ping-ponging between Tanaitic sources and Amoraitic sources, okay? And you can see the chart, the colors always show what's Tana, what's Amora. So for example, the previous one about the things that were absorbed in the ground, we started with a Braita, the Rabbi Shmaya Bekalnavo brought, Hatane. He brought a Braita about this. And the second was a statement of Abaye, which is an Amoraitic statement. So just so you're aware of the differences between them, not that it necessarily makes a big difference, but it's interesting to know whether these existed in the time of the Tanaim or only the Amoraim. Obviously, the Amoraim had a tradition about it that may have dated back to the Tanaitic time period, but we don't have it in the form of a Tanaitic source. Likewise, here we have Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, who is an Amora speaking. So, Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Nes Gadol Hayana Sabalechem Apanim, Siluko Kesidro. Becky, this is what you mentioned. There was a big miracle about the Lechem Apanim, the showbread. When you took it off, it was in the exact same state as it was when you brought it in. Shenemar Lasum Lechem Chom B'Yom Hilakcho. This is a verse from Sefer Shmuel when the Kohen gives him bread, and he says all the bread they have was the Lechem Apanim, and it says, Lasum lechem chom b'yomi lakcho. It's the bread that was placed before God that was basically brought out hot the same way it was brought in. There were 2 miracles really here because they would bring the bread in on Shabbat. It was baked already Friday and it was still hot. And then when they brought it off a week later, it was also still hot. So that was a big miracle that happened with the lechem apanim. So we can add that one in place of the missing one. Now, why do they want to keep going back to this 10? Because they want to make this Mishnah make sense. And it's interesting because they're rereading the Mishnah, because they're taking out and putting in and saying, okay, this isn't that. But they want to stick to this idea of the 10 miracles, okay? Because that's what it says. And they have this idea, if they had a number, right? This is very common, by the way, that a Mishnah recites a number, okay? So there's a number. So the number must be right because that people don't confuse. But which things are part of that number might fluctuate depending on your tradition or something like that. So the Gemara basically keeps saying, well, there's this and there's that and there's other ones. And they're trying to get to a list of 10 that includes, if possible, all the ones mentioned. So now again, let's just review. So we had all the ones listed in Masechet Avot. We took out the last two because we said they have to do with Yerushalayim and not the temple. We substituted in two that have to do with the temple, with the fire, not going out in the rain, and the smoke always being straight and not moving to the side. Then we took the Omer, Shtei Alechem, and Lechem HaPanim and joined it into one. To that we added all the things that get swallowed up in their place. We first added them as two in the missing two spots. Now we squeeze those into one, and then we add this Lechem HaPanim, okay? And then we're basically done with the list. We're going to have some questions on some other things, and the answer to those is going to be they're not included for various reasons, okay? So we're done with moving our list around and shifting and adding, but we're still not done with our questions. V'tuleka, are there no more? V'hama Rabbi Levi, davar zeh misoret biyadenu me'avotenu. We have another miracle that we have a tradition about. Mikom aron eino min amida. When they discuss the room of Kodesh HaKodeshim, it's 20 amot by 20 amot. Now, they talk about the fact, this is an interesting miracle, that there's 20 cubits in both directions, but not only is the room 20 cubits by 20 cubits, but on the sides of the Aron, there were 20 cubits on all sides, which means that the Aron didn't take up any space in the room. Okay, that's a little bit hard to imagine, right? So it would have to be a miracle that the Aron didn't take up space in the room somehow. Also, the kruvim, there were these kruvim that took up space in the whole room. Okay, they basically stood in the room. I'll actually take out this picture from a book that I have about the kruvim. Anyway, I'll find it in a minute. But the kruvim took up space in the room, and it was said about the kruvim in Sefer Melachim, it describes them, okay, the cherubs, that they okay, so that they were each wing, okay, cherub has wings. Each wing took up 5 amot each. So there's, right, 2 cherubs, 4 wings. So it took up 20 cubits. Now, if it takes up 20 cubits, then that basically covers the entire space of the room. And what about the body of the cherub itself, both of them? So it says, Kruvim b'neis hayu omdim, and they didn't take up any space in the room. Again, the body of the cherubs didn't take up any space. Okay, I can't find the picture for some reason. The picture's actually in the Koran also, but I have a nice big picture of it in my book. Trying to find it, but I don't see it. Okay, tough. I don't know why I don't see it. Okay, anyway, I have this book. It's just, if you want to have ideas of books, there's a whole bunch of them. Each of them are different. I'm not saying I recommend one over the other. This happens to be the one I'm using, Encyclopedia Karta Beit HaMikdash B'Yerushalayim, and they have lots and lots of pictures of the temple and things inside the temple. And it's, it just helps you visualize these things. So it's helpful. Okay. I don't know why I can't find it. Okay. Anyway, let's move on. I'm going to waste more time on it. But you can imagine, you basically have these cherubs going across the room, and their wings are spanning each one 5 amot. They take up 20 amot, and yet their body doesn't take up space. So now, why aren't these in the list? To which the Gemara says, Nisei de barai kachashiv, nisei de gavai lo kachashiv. They only mention things that are inside. They don't mention things that, outside. They don't mention things that are inside. In other words, we're talking about miracles that were seen to everybody. These miracles weren't seen to everyone because they're inside the sanctuary, right? And this is in the Kodesh HaKodeshim. Forget about the sanctuary. It's in the Holy of Holies. Nobody was in the Holy of Holies other than the Kohen Gadol once a year. We're not mentioning miracles that are inside. We're only mentioning miracles that everyone could see. So now they say, really? Are you sure? But you added the lechem hapanim to the list. Now, lechem hapanim, the showbread, was a miracle that nobody saw because it was inside the sanctuary. Also, there people didn't go. So why are you mentioning that? So they say, oh, in fact, lechem hapanim nisa debarayu. You can consider that a miracle that happened outside. Why? So you'll have to wait a few minutes to get there, but we're going to explain. Okay, this is from what we just read yesterday. I hope you noticed there were all sorts of connections to the parsha yesterday. So it said, so you put the lechem hapanim on the shulchan tahor, on the holy table. So now, why does it call it holy table? Holy table seems to infer tahor michlal shu tameh, seems to infer that it could become impure. Now the table is made of wood. So if the table can become impure, that means it's, so we're going to now talk about wood and what we know about wood and becoming impure. Clay eitz hasoy lenachatu. How could it become impure? It's made of wood. It's covered with gold, but its base is wood, and therefore it gets treated like a wood. This is a kli that's intended to be on the ground at all times, right? It doesn't move. They didn't move the table. So it was meant to be stable, always on the floor. Now, there's a rule. There's two things we know about a clay eitz. Now, the clay eitz, a wooden utensil, is the same verse as a clay ore. Or usually they used, it was leather, it was used for a sack. What's known about a sack? It's carried, right? You carry it empty, you carry it if it's full, unless it's too full. Anyway, you carry it. So therefore, they assume eitz has to be something that can be carried. Now, this table was on the ground, it wasn't carried. So therefore, if it's not, it doesn't have the same criteria as the ore, then it's not mekabel tumah. It's not susceptible to impurity. And not only that, it's chotzeitz b'fnei tumah. This is irrelevant to our purposes, but if there's, let's say, a dead body underneath, usually we say the tumah goes all the way up unless it's covered with a tent or something. And if it has something that's made of eitz, since it doesn't become tameh, it stops the tumah from going beyond. So if there's a table and underneath it is bones of a dead person, so the tumah will not go all the way up. So now we have, or a flesh, I should say really flesh of a dead body. So now we say the following. Ela milamed, so how could it be it's called tahor if it's not susceptible to impurity because it's stable in its place? Well, I said that we never carry the table, but now we're going to learn they did carry it. They would pick it up every time there was aliyah l'regel and people would come. They wanted to show everybody, look what's going on in the temple. Look at this amazing miracle. So they would pick up the table, they would lift it up so people outside could look through the gate of the ulam. They could look through the gate of the ulam, right? Even if they're standing outside in the Ezrat Nashim, right? They could see through. Remember, all the gates were opposite each other. So people could look and they would lift up the table so everyone could see. And they would say to them, look how much God loves you. Look how hot they are. They're piping hot. That's how hot they were. They were steaming. Otherwise, people couldn't see that they were hot. So they must have been steaming hot. So here, what do you see? It's true the lechem apanim happened inside, but it was a miracle that was visible to everybody outside because they would lift the table. And that we all learned from the fact that it's called tahor. That implies it could be tameh. If it could be tameh, by the way, if you remember, we also learned that it could be tameh because we had a whole thing about dunking it in the mikveh. And did they have to cut it? Was it made in two parts so that it could fit in the mikveh or not, depending on how big the mikveh was that was in the azara? Remember, because you can't take it out of the azara, so you'd have to tovel it in the azara. And could it fit based on its dimensions? So we had a whole discussion about that not so long ago, probably in Shkalim. Anyway, that connects to this. Well, we're not done yet with our questions. Vitula, Leka, are there no more? This is a really interesting one. When Shlomo built the temple, he planted in there trees of gold. Okay, trees that grew gold. Every year, the fruits would grow in their appropriate time, whatever the time is for golden fruits. And when the wind would blow, they would fall off the tree. Again, we have sounds, right? The Livanon, the fruits of Livanon will make noise because imagine gold falling on the ground. It makes a lot of noise, not like an apple that falls. Even an apple makes a little bit of a, right? In my house, I have these star fruits that always fall off the tree, and everyone, you're sitting in the house and all of a sudden you hear this thump on the ground and it's the fruit falling from the tree. So anyway, you hear this noise of what's Livanon. Livanon is a reference to the temple. So the Peirot of Livanon make noise. That must be these golden fruits of Shlomo. And when they took over, the Gentiles took over the temple, it all dried up. We're now quoting verses. This is from Chagai. This is from Nahum. The prachim of Lebanon are now no longer, right? They're what's the word? They're in bad situation. Umlal is usually someone in a bad situation, devastated. Okay, the Atira Kadosh Baruch Hu lachziran, but God will ultimately bring these fruits back. Shene'amar paroach tefrach betagel af gilat veranen kavod Lebanon nitan la. Okay, everything will blossom again, and everyone will be joyful because the glory of Lebanon has returned to it. So the Lebanon is a reference to the temple. And here we have all these references to these fruit trees that were there in the temple. So they must have been these golden fruit trees that Shlomo, there was another miracle. So why isn't this miracle, right? To grow golden fruit trees would be a miracle. Some people say, by the way, that the Kohanim took these fruits and sold them, and that's how they have money. So they say, Nisa dikfi lo kachashi. Oh, the list, now we're going to learn. Well, the list includes certain things we had before. It includes things that are outside and not things that are inside. Now we're going to say it includes things that happened all the time and not things that were a one-time thing. The fruit trees growing there was a one-time thing. It's true that it changed also, but it was something that things that happen. I think what it means, because I see a little bit of the chat here, but that things that change and that happen either on a daily basis or once in a while, those things are there. But things that are constants, the fact that the tree grew was the miracle. Maybe the fact that it has fruits also, but really it's the fact that the tree grew. Okay, so that's a constant miracle. That's not mentioned in this list. To which they say now, well, if you're already going to give that answer, let's give that as the answer to the previous category. Aaron ukruvim nami nise dikvihen. Right? The Aaron and the cherubs was also a miracle that was constant. It never changed. One time it was put in and it didn't take up space, and it was still 20 cubits in all directions. And the bodies of the kruvim didn't take up any space. That was a one-time thing, and it was just there all the time. So that could be an answer also to that question. And then we wouldn't have had the question on the lechem hapanim that we need to explain that they then showed it to everybody outside. Now I said we get back to this Ashan Hamaracha, the smoke that's coming up from where the fire is in the temple, on the altar, on the outside altar. Umi have Ashan b'maracha, was there really fire, smoke there? The Hatanya, doesn't it say, Chamishat dvarim ne'emru be'esh hamaracha? There were 5 things said about the fire that was on the maracha. Rivutza ke'ari, it's crouched like a lion. Uvara ke'chama, clear like the sun. V'yesh b'mamash, and it has, yesh b'mamash is, right, Rashi says, b'shalhevet shala, it had a nice, it had substance, had a nice flame to it. V'ochevet lachin kiveshim, it would devour wet, damp twigs, just like it would, or logs, just like it would dry ones, right? We all know when you make a fire, the liquid, the moist ones are much harder to be devoured. But this would eat it in the same manner, ve'enam alashan, and no smoke would rise from it. So what do they answer? Oh, there were 2 fires. Kika amrinam b'dehedyot. That was said, what we said about the Ashana Maracha. We said here, the Chamishat Dvarim Be'esh Maracha was about the one that came from God. And the one that we mentioned about the Ashana Maracha, that it would always go up straight, right? And then, right, even all the winds would come, it wouldn't blow it. That smoke came out of there. That was the regular one that the Kohanim lit. Titania, as it says in a Braita, V'natnu b'nei Aaron HaKohen esh al hamizbeach, which we're going to see this in a few days, this fire that the sons of Aaron would light on the altar. So, and why are they commanded to bring a fire? Doesn't God bring the fire down? That was the whole thing with Nadav and Aviv. So the point is that God brings a fire down, and there was some fire that was brought. There was this coal that was kind of brought from God from the beginning, both in the tabernacle and in the Mishkan and in the first temple, in Bayit Sheni and Bayit Rishon. We'll see, maybe also Bayit Sheni. That was given by God, and that had all these criteria, these 5 things that we saw, and no smoke coming out of it, which is the one that we're talking about. But the one that Aaron or the Kohanim later built on their own, which they would do every day, it's a mitzvah to do every day. We'll talk about all the details of it in a few days, but that they would build every day. So there were 2 fires going on, and they were each talking about different ones. So now they can ask more questions about this. It's crouched like a lion, which, by the way, is not clear what that means. Does it mean it has a lot of strength like a lion, or does it mean the position of it? It looks crouched down, like it's low, maybe like a lion. Here we have always our testimony from our favorite Rav Chananya, the Skana Kohanim, Rabbi Chananya. I saw it because he was alive in the time of the temple, right? He was the Skana Kohanim. It was more like a dog, not like a lion. So Lokashya kam b'mikdash rishon, kam b'mikdash sheni. We go back again to these differences between the first temple and the second temple. In the second temple, it already didn't have the strength that it had in the first temple. Ub'mikdash sheni mihavai. Did it even exist in the second temple? This is a pasuk from Chagai. Okay, it says, Alu hahar, go up to the har, vehebitem eitz, ubanu abayit. Go up and rebuild the temple. Ve'ertsebo ve'ikabda amar Hashem. And I will be appeased there, and I will be respected there. But it says the word ikabda without the hey at the end. It's missing a hey. So it says there, it's written as ikabda without the hey. V'karina, but we read it as ikabda with a hey. Why is it missing that hey? He's talking about obviously his nevuah is at the end of Bayit Rishon and in the Galut, and he says you're going to go back and rebuild the temple, the second temple. So now it's saying you're going to rebuild it missing 5 things. That's what the hay is reflective of, the missing hay. It's going to be missing the aron, the kaporet, which was this gold cover at the top of it, and then above that the kruvim. You're not going to have that. Number 2. You're not going to have the fire anymore, which is why we asked this question. Wasn't there no fire in Bayit Sheni? So how could you say in Bayit Sheni it was less of a fire when it says here there was no fire from God? Ushchina, God's presence won't be there anymore. We saw this. Uruach HaKodesh, there's not going to be any more prophecy, which by the way, there's a debate. Rashi says here, from the second year of Daryavish. There's a big debate about this. Was it from the second year of Daryavish? Was it from the 4th year of Daryavish? And then some people say, actually, it even went into the beginning of Bayit Sheni, and there was still some nevuah until the last Nevi'im Achronim died. There's a bit of a debate about when exactly there was no prophecy. I wanted you just to know that there's a debate about this. So that's number 3. Now we're up to number 4. That was right. Ruach HaKodesh was number 4, and Urim V'Tumim. Like the Urim V'Tumim, where they would ask God questions. It's kind of similar to Nevuah. That also didn't exist. So what do they answer? Amri'im midahave siyua lo Messiah. So now they said, well, the fire was still there. There was still this coal that was burning from, right? It came down from God. However, it wasn't strong enough, or wasn't used at all to burn the sacrifices. It was still there. It was symbolic, but it wasn't used. So that's why we could talk about it as if it wasn't there, because it wasn't useful there. But it actually did exist. Tanu Rabbanan, since we're talking about fire, we're now going to, and we talked about some unique qualities of this fire, we're going to talk about 6 types of fires that exist. So first we're going to list them, then we're going to explain what they are. Sheshi shotim, yesh ochelet ve'ena shota, eats but doesn't drink. Yesh shota ve'ena ochelet, the reverse of drinks, doesn't eat. Yesh ochelet ve'shota, eats and drinks. Yesh ochelet lachin ki yeveshim, eats liquid, moist things, and just like dry things. That's the one we saw. Yesh esh tocha esh, fire that pushes out fire. Yesh esh ochelet esh, fire that eats fire. So what are these things? Yesh esh ochelet ve'ena shota. That means hadidan. That's a regular fire. It burns solids, not liquids. Shota ve'ena ochelet decholim. That's sick people. Sick people have this fever that burns in them. It dries up all your liquids. That's why you're dehydrated, but it doesn't increase your appetite for eating. That's how they explain this. Ochelet v'shota, that's Eliyahu. If you remember the whole thing at Har Carmel, they put out water and the fire drank up the water, right? It was his stand up against the Nevi'ei Habal. Ochelet lachin ki yeveshim is the maracha. That's what we saw. Swallow it, right? It burns the liquid, the moist ones, just like the dry ones. Yesh esh tocha esh, that's the Gabriel. We saw this at the end of Pesachim, where how did he save Hananiah, Mishael, and Arzayah? He burnt from the outside and cooled from the inside of the furnace. And that way he burned all those around. Esh ochelet esh, that's the Shechina. Okay, Rashi says in Sanhedrin, it's discussed that when God wanted to create man, the angels or humans, the angels came down and said, no, ma enosh kitis kerenu, humans are just bad. Why are you going to bother? They're just going to be evil. To which God, Damar Mar Hoshit etzba'o b'nehem u'srafan, he put his hand down and his finger down and burnt them all. So here you have Esh that burns fire. Okay, it destroyed fire because the angels are considered like fire. Okay, another question on Ashana Maracha. It doesn't move, it goes straight up. To which the Gemara asks, on the last day of Sukkot, everyone wants to know, there's some sign in the temple, kind of like in Yom Kippur, there's this sign where the sins forbid, where they pardon. We'll get to that, but the red turning white. Here also, they want to see a sign, did our prayers get accepted for rain? So they look at the smoke coming out of the Maracha. If it's facing, if it's moving, right, swaying toward, now this is a problem, it doesn't sway, we just said. So if it sways toward the north, the poor are happy. The balabayits, the owners of the property owners are sad, the rich people. There's going to be a lot of rains, too many rains that all their storage stuff is going to rot. It's going to be too moist, which means they're going to have to sell everything. Supply and demand, if they're going to have to sell everything, the prices are going to drop, and it's going to be good for the poor, bad for the rich, right? Sounds like the tax plan, right? Right? Good, right? Do we do a tax plan that's good for the, right? Do we change the taxes to be tax the rich to help the poor? That's what this is saying, right? One thing, whatever helps one person is going to hurt the other. Nata klape darom, which shows that the north wind is coming if it's swaying toward the south. This is the reverse. There's not a lot of rain, and the crops will last, which basically means that it's good for the rich because they'll be able to sell for high price and keep all their stored stuff and sell over time. If the western wind is coming and therefore it sways to the east, that's a perfect amount, average, not too much, not too bad. It's right in the middle. That's the dry wind, which brings no rain, and then nobody will have anything. Everybody's unhappy. So now, how do we have this that it sways and yet we said it doesn't sway? So the answer is think about a palm tree. A palm tree sways just a little bit, but it doesn't disperse. That's what we were talking about. It's not a smoke that disperses. It sounds like the k'toret also we talked about, right? How it goes up and it doesn't disperse. Last part for today, Amar Mar, but wait, you just said in this source that Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Abdimi said, which means the west wind is a good wind. The east wind is a bad wind. But it says in a Braita, Mizrachit la'olam yafeh, it's the eastern wind that's good. And Maravit la'olam kasheh, it's the western one that's bad. So it seems the reverse. And they say, by the way, this isn't relevant for our purposes, but we'll read it. The northern wind, which brings some rain, is good for the chitim once they've already, the wheat, once it's grown to a third of its growth. But they're bad for the olives when they first start blossoming, because they need a lot more rain, and it shows a lot of rain is not going to be coming. Ruach dromit, which is going to show a lot of rain is coming, is they're not good for the wheat once it grows to a third, because too much rain is going to come and we don't want too much rain. But they're good for the olives. And how do you remember this? This is cute. If you know, now you have to know the first part, but if you know the Shulchan b'tzafon u'midorah b'darom, then you'll remember this, because the shulchan is in the tzafon. What do you put on the shulchan? The bread, which is made of wheat. So the north wind is good for the wheat, and the menorah has the olive oil. So the south one is good for the olives. Anyway, back to our contradiction: is the west wind good or bad, and the east wind good or bad? Lo kashya halan halehu. Oh, it's a difference between the Babylonians and the ones in Eretz Israel. In Babylonia, they had a lot of rain. Too much rain wasn't a good thing. In Israel, as we know, there's a lot less rain, and therefore a lot of rain is good. So how does this work? The one that the Braita that said Mizrachit is always good, that's for the Babylonians, because the Mizrachit is bringing not so much rain. The Maravit is bringing a lot of rain. That's the one that's good for Israel, but bad for the Babylonians. And with that, Hadran alach shivat yamim, we finish our parak, and we'll move tomorrow to the second parak, as I said, with a very interesting sugya about religious zealousy and people trying to be, get as involved as they can in the temple service, which sometimes is not always a good thing. Have a Shavua Tov, everyone.